Usually when you look at a map of like a massive empire, there is this illusion of absolute permanence.
Right, yeah. It feels set in stone.
Exactly. You see these bold, thick lines drawn across continents marking out kingdoms, and you just assume those lines aren't going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, we are so conditioned to think borders are absolute,
Yeah.
that once a civilization plants its flag, it's just there forever.
But then you zoom in on the actual historical mechanics of how those borders are drawn and how they're maintained, and suddenly you realize that that stone is actually just wet sand.
Yeah, it really is.
It's this precarious balancing act that can just be washed away in an instant. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring the historical realities detailed in Chapter 2, Saladin and the Greatest Clash, and Chapter 3, The Fall of the Crusading Age.
Which is just a fascinating period.
Oh, totally. Our mission today is to really explore the dramatic turning points, the tactical brilliance, and, well, the shocking betrayals that define the rise and fall of the Crusading Age.
And, if you are sitting there wondering why a medieval conflict matters to you today, I promise you, this isn't just trite dates and names.
No, not at all.
Right. This history is an absolute masterclass in strategy, leadership, and the incredibly unpredictable consequences of human ambition. Like, it's really about how fragile power truly is.
Yeah. If you've ever wondered how massive institutions crumble from the inside out, or how a single disciplined leader can completely redraw the map of the world, this deep dive is definite for you.
For sure.
So we're starting with this massive power vacuum in the Middle East. The original Crusaders had set up their states, but after the fall of this key northern stronghold called Edessa, Europe just panics.
Oh, completely panics.
Right. And they launched the Second Crusade to get it back. Now, on paper, this looks like an unstoppable corporate merger. You have two massive egos, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, combining their forces.
Yeah, it sounds great on paper.
But the execution is just a spectacular failure.
It really is a complete collapse of leadership.
Yeah.
You have these two incredibly powerful monarchs marching toward the Holy Land, but they bring all their domestic rivalries with them.
Right.
There is zero unified chain of command. I mean, their supply lines are an absolute mess. They get exhausted by the harsh Anatolian terrain, and by the time they actually reach the region, they're basically a fractured force.
It's just falling apart.
Exactly. And then they make this baffling strategic decision. Instead of marching on Edessa, which was literally their entire stated purpose, they pivot and attack Damascus.
Which I just don't understand that. I mean, if your board of directors approves a massive budget to acquire Company A, you don't just suddenly buy Company B on a whim. Like, why did they do that?
Well, it really comes down to greed and, political pressure. Edessa had already been thoroughly sacked by Muslim forces by that point.
So it was just gone.
Yeah, it was in ruins. There was very little glory or wealth left to win there. But Damascus, on the other hand, was one of the oldest, wealthiest cities in the region.
Oh, okay.
It was surrounded by these lush orchards. So the European kings basically wanted a lucrative prize to justify the massive expense of the crusade to their nobles back home.
It makes sense politically, but it backfired completely, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Damascus had previously been somewhat neutral, acting as a buffer.
Yeah.
By attacking it, the Crusaders actually forced the city to call for reinforcements from the broader Muslim world.
Wow. And the siege lasts, what, just a few days before they get spooked, run out of supplies, and retreat in total humiliation?
Yeah, pretty much.
So the massive corporate merger goes bankrupt almost immediately. But meanwhile, across the street in the Muslim world, you have the ultimate meticulous startup founder quietly going to work, just capitalizing on that failure.
Yeah, that would be Nur-ad-Din, and more importantly, his protege, Saladin. Nur-ad-Din understood this fundamental truth that the Crusaders were just ignoring, which is that divided, fragmented territories could never win.
Right.
So he began systematically uniting Syria. And when he died, Saladin took that foundation and expanded it brilliantly.
And Saladin is just so fascinating. Born in 1137, a Kurd, and he's not your typical reckless, glory-hungry warrior.
Not at all.
He gets sent to Egypt, which is being run by the declining Fatimid Caliphate. And when his uncle dies, he is unexpectedly appointed vizier. He's young, people doubt him, but he essentially treats Egypt like this massive turnaround project. How does he actually pull that off?
Well, he focuses on the mechanics of statecraft before ever worrying about warfare. Saladin doesn't just take over the military. He rebuilds the entire economic engine of Egypt.
Really?
Yeah, he reorganizes the agricultural land grants to ensure he has this steady, reliable stream of tax revenue. And then he uses that wealth to essentially buy the loyalty of different factions and, to modernize his army.
Wow.
By 1171, he formally ends the Fatimid Caliphate and restores Sunni rule, which aligns Egypt ideologically with Syria. He spends years just securing strategic strongholds, basically building a ring of iron around the Crusader states.
So while the European factions are like fighting over petty grievances, Saladin is building a monopoly. He unites Egypt and Syria, and for the first time in generations, the Crusaders are staring down a single unified Muslim empire.
Exactly.
And this brings us to a boiling point, because the Kingdom of Jerusalem is rotting from the inside out. They have a king, Baldwin IV, who is courageous, but he's suffering from leprosy.
Right, and leprosy meant Baldwin could not produce an heir, which created this vicious succession crisis. The noble families of Jerusalem basically stopped focusing on the external threat of Saladin and turned all their energy inward.
Just totally distracted.
Yeah, they formed rival factions using marriages and political assassinations to jockey for influence over the eventual throne. It was a kingdom entirely consumed by its own internal drama.
And into this highly combustible environment steps a man named Reynold of Chatillon, who essentially just lights the match.
He really does. Reynold was this aggressive, rogue crusader lord who controlled a massive castle near the frontier. And he completely refused to respect the fragile truces that the king of Jerusalem had negotiated with Saladin.
He just ignored them.
Completely. Reynold repeatedly launched raids against peaceful Muslim trade caravans. He even threatened to attack the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, aiming to disrupt the Hajj pilgrimage.
Wow. And for Saladin, this crosses every conceivable line. He swears he will destroy Reynold. And this leads us to the summer of 1187 and the Battle of Hattin.
Right.
Saladin gathers a massive army. But I want to push back on the Crusaders' decision-making here. They march out into the desert in heavy armor under the burning July sun. Like, were they just entirely incompetent, or was Saladin pulling off a tactical masterpiece?
I mean, it is a combination of fatal political pressure and Saladin's absolute mastery of environmental warfare. The Crusaders actually knew it was a bad idea to leave their well-watered stronghold.
Oh, they knew.
Yeah, but politically, the king of Jerusalem couldn't look weak. While Saladin was besieging a nearby Crusader town, they felt forced to march. And Saladin anticipated this. He controlled the wells along their route. Just imagine being a Crusader knight.
Oh, man.
You're carrying 50 pounds of metal and padding. It is July in the Middle East, and your water runs out on the first day.
It sounds like a psychological nightmare.
It absolutely was. Saladin used fast-moving light cavalry to harass the Crusaders, constantly, shooting arrows and retreating, completely refusing to let them rest.
Wow.
And then he used the environment as a weapon. He actually had his troops set fire to the dry scrub brush upwind of the Crusader army.
That is brutal.
Yeah, the smoke blinded them, the heat was suffocating, and the thirst was agonizing. The Crusader formation simply dissolved under the physical and psychological torture. They were forced to make a desperate stand at the horns of Hattin, and they were completely annihilated.
It's just devastating. And the aftermath is huge for Europe. The king of Jerusalem is captured, the sacred relic known as a true cross is lost, and Reynold of Chatillon is executed by Saladin himself, fulfilling that promise.
Yep.
So the Crusader cities surrender one by one, and Saladin marches on the greatest prize of all, which is Jerusalem. And here's where it gets really interesting, because, you expect a bloodbath. When the Crusaders originally took Jerusalem in 1099, they slaughtered the inhabitants. But Saladin doesn't do that.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Saladin's mercy at Jerusalem was just as calculated and strategic as his environmental warfare at Hattin.
How so?
Well, he surrounded the city, negotiated with the defenders, and allowed them to surrender peacefully on October 10, 1187. Many Christians were allowed to ransom themselves, and Saladin even freed thousands of others who couldn't pay. He ordered his troops to protect the Christian holy sites.
Which is incredible restraint for that era.
It really is. By offering peaceful terms, Saladin basically prevented a desperate to-the-death defense by the Christians, which would have destroyed the city and cost him thousands of his own soldiers.
Ah, right.
And furthermore, he cemented his legacy. He signaled to the entire region that his new unified empire would be built on order, justice, and stability, not just mindless vengeance.
But of course, Europe doesn't see it that way at all. The loss of Jerusalem sends shockwaves across the continent. They essentially assemble the medieval Avengers for the Third Crusade.
Yeah, it was an unprecedented mobilization.
Yeah.
You had Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Empire, King Philip II of France, and King Richard the Lionheart of England. These were the absolute titans of the age.
Though, Barbarossa literally drowns while crossing a river in Anatolia, sending a huge chunk of his army packing.
Right. Unfortunate detour there.
Yeah, but Richard the Lionheart makes it, and he proves to be an absolute military genius. He captures the strategic port of Acre, and then he marches his army south down the coast. Now, Saladin tries to repeat his Hatton tactics at a place called Arsuf in 1191, but Richard doesn't fall for it.
No, he doesn't. This is a masterclass in military discipline.
Yeah.
At Arsuf, Richard is marching his army along the coast, keeping the sea on his right to protect his flank.
Smart.
Saladin is on his left, just unleashing constant waves of cavalry archers, trying to sting the Crusaders into breaking their tight formation.
Oh.
Because Saladin knows that if the heavy Christian knights charge out prematurely, they will spread out, lose momentum, and just be slaughtered.
Like at Hatton.
Exactly. Richard knows this too. He orders his men to march through a literal rain of arrows, taking casualties, sweating in the heat, but absolutely forbidding anyone to break ranks.
That takes insane discipline.
He holds them under that immense pressure until Saladin's forces get overconfident and push too close. And at that exact perfect moment, Richard orders a massive, coordinated cavalry charge that completely sweeps the Muslim forces from the field.
It is a stunning victory for Richard. So what
Yeah.
does this all mean? Because we have this unstoppable force in Richard meeting an immovable object in Saladin. And astonishingly, after all this brilliant tactical maneuvering and bloodshed, they look at the map and realize they have to stop.
Yeah, Richard recognizes a fundamental reality of logistics. He realizes he might be able to capture Jerusalem, but he can never hold it.
Why not?
His supply lines back to Europe were thousands of miles long, while Saladin was fighting his own backyard with the unified resources of Egypt and Syria right behind him. Pure military might has limits. You cannot hold a hostile inland city without an infrastructure to support it.
So they sign a piece of paper, the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. Jerusalem stays under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims get guaranteed safe access. They both walk away exhausted but legendary. But, that peace was just a Band-Aid. Without Saladin as a unifying enemy because he dies a year later, and without a clear, achievable religious target, the entire crusading movement starts to mutate into something deeply cynical.
It devolves rapidly.
Yeah.
The noble ideological veneer strips away, and we see how quickly holy wars can be dictated by cold, hard economics.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the Fourth Crusade might be one of the most absurd events in military history. Imagine you organize a massive sacred mission to take back the Holy Land, but you end up destroying your own side's most magnificent city just to settle a shipping invoice.
Yeah, it's wild.
Like, how does a holy war become a debt collection agency?
Well, it starts with a catastrophic logistical miscalculation. In 1198, Pope Innocent III calls for a new crusade. The leaders negotiate a contract with the Republic of Venice to build a massive fleet to transport their armies to Egypt. Venice essentially suspends its entire commercial economy for a year to build these ships. But when the departure date arrives, only a fraction of the expected crusaders actually show up in Venice.
So they are sitting there with all these expensive ships and nowhere near enough money to pay the bill.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how the logistical reality completely overrides the religious mission. The Venetians are facing absolute economic ruin if they don't get paid.
Right.
So the Doge of Venice offers a deeply cynical solution. He tells the Crusaders, "We will defer your debt if you help us capture Zara." Zara was a wealthy port city on the Adriatic coast. The problem: Zara was a Catholic city.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it belonged to the King of Hungary, who was himself a crusader. Despite the Pope explicitly forbidding it and excommunicating the leaders, the Crusaders attack and capture Zara in 1202 just to service their debt.
They repossess a Christian city, and
Yeah.
it gets worse. Because while they're wintering in Zara, a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos approaches them with a pitch. He says his father was unjustly overthrown from the Byzantine throne in Constantinople, and he tells the Crusaders, if you divert your fleet, sail to Constantinople, and put me back in power, I will pay off all your debt to Venice, I will give you a massive army, and I will fund your crusade to Egypt.
It sounded like the perfect bailout for them. So they sail to Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christianity, and they actually managed to put Alexios on the throne in 1203.
Wow.
But once in power, Alexios realizes the royal treasury is empty. He completely cannot pay the exorbitant sums he promised.
He overpromised to investors and couldn't deliver, so the Crusaders are stranded outside the city walls, starving, angry, and still in massive debt. So in 1204, tensions explode.
Yeah, the Crusaders breached the walls of Constantinople, and for 3 days, they systematically sacked the city. This was the jewel of the medieval world, you know. Its walls had protected Christianity for nearly a millennium. The Crusaders looted ancient treasures, destroyed irreplaceable manuscripts, and desecrated churches, literally stripping the gold from the altars. They absolutely devastated the Byzantine Empire, permanently fracturing Eastern and Western Christianity, all to carve out a short-lived state called the Latin Empire.
It is the ultimate betrayal of their founding ideals, and after that profound moral failure, the crusading strategy permanently shifts. European leaders realize that marching on Jerusalem is useless. If you want to dominate the region, you have to cut the head off the snake. You have to control the wealth and agricultural power of Egypt.
Which launches the Fifth Crusade in 1217. They land in Egypt and successfully besiege the critical port city of Damietta. They have a foothold. But then, they make a fatal geographic error. They decide to march south toward Cairo during the summer.
Wait, I need to stop you there. We are talking about massive royal armies. How does an entire army just lose to geography? Like, what actually happened on the ground?
Well, they completely misunderstood the mechanics of the Nile River. The Nile Delta isn't just a river, it is a complex web of canals and floodplains.
Okay.
The Crusaders marched south just as the annual Nile flood was beginning. The Egyptian forces simply opened the sluice gates and breached the dikes behind the Crusader army.
So they intentionally flooded the land.
Yes, exactly. The Crusaders suddenly found themselves trapped on a narrow causeway surrounded by rising water and deep mud.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Their supply lines back to the coast were completely severed. Starving and unable to move their heavy equipment, they had absolutely no choice but to surrender the territory they had won and just sail home. Geography defeated them.
Which makes the events of 1228 so deeply ironic. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire arrives for the Sixth Crusade, but unlike the zealots who came before him, Frederick speaks Arabic. He appreciates Islamic culture, and instead of launching a massive bloody attack, he basically just sits down with the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil.
Because Frederick understood leverage. Both he and the Sultan were dealing with major domestic political issues, and honestly, neither wanted a drawn-out war.
Yeah.
So through pure diplomatic negotiation, Frederick signs a treaty that gives the Crusaders control of Jerusalem for 10 years without shedding a drop of blood.
He achieves what generations of holy warriors couldn't, and he does it with paperwork.
Exactly.
But of course, that temporary truce expires. And the contrast is striking when you look at King Louis IX of France during the Seventh Crusade in 1248. He is deeply religious, highly armed, and completely insists on fighting.
Right.
He invades Egypt, pushes into a city called Mansoura, and engages in this brutal urban warfare.
And pitched battles in open fields favor the heavily armored European knights. But inside the narrow, twisting streets of an Egyptian city, their cavalry is completely useless.
Oh, I bet.
They are pelted with debris from the rooftops, ambushed at literally every intersection, and completely outmaneuvered. Louis's army is decimated, and the King of France himself is actually taken prisoner and held for an astronomical ransom.
And the force that defeated him in those narrow streets represents a massive systemic shift in the Middle East. The rise of the Mamluks.
Yeah, the Mamluks were originally enslaved soldiers, purchased as boys from the Eurasian steppes, and rigorously trained in elite cavalry tactics. They eventually overthrew their masters in Egypt and established this incredibly powerful military caste.
Wow.
Under their most brilliant sultan, Baibars, they completely changed the strategic game. And this raises an important question about military adaptation. Baibars realized that defeating Crusader armies in the field just wasn't enough, because Europe would just keep sending more.
So how do you stop a threat that has an endless supply of reinforcements?
You destroy their infrastructure. Baibars recognized that the Crusader states were artificial. They completely relied on massive stone castles along the coast to receive supplies and troops from Italian ships.
Oh, okay.
So Baibars didn't just capture castles to use them for himself. He instituted a scorched earth policy. When he took a coastal fortress, he forced his troops to dismantle it stone by stone. Yeah, he threw the rubble into the harbors to prevent European galleys from docking. He systematically erased their physical footprint.
He realized that if you cut the umbilical cord to the sea, the colonies just die, and that leads to the final blow. By 1291, the only major Crusader possession left is the great city of Acre. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrives with a massive Mamluk army and enormous siege engines.
Right.
The military orders, the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, fight desperately on the walls, but the sheer math is just against them. The walls are breached, Acre falls, the surviving Crusaders literally flee onto ships and sail away. The wet sand just washes out to sea.
Yeah. And when you synthesize the history we've explored today, the legacy is just profoundly complex. The Crusades were an era of intense religious violence, political betrayal, and the destruction of ancient kingdoms. Millions suffered.
Yeah.
But the historical reality is also that this relentless warfare forced two vastly different worlds into close, sustained contact for 2 centuries.
You really can't ignore the cross-pollination. I mean, when you have armies moving across continents, they don't just bring swords, they bring ideas.
Exactly.
European medicine, architecture, and navigation were heavily influenced by the scholars and engineers of the Islamic world, which essentially accelerated the intellectual development that would eventually spark the Renaissance.
It forces us to view history not as a simple narrative of good versus evil, but as a really messy story of human ambition. The physical ruins of those castles in the Middle East today stand as monuments to both the tragedy of intolerance and the forced exchange of knowledge that happens when civilizations collide.
Which brings us right back to those thick lines drawn on the map we talked about at the very beginning. It leaves us with this uncomfortable realization about how human progress actually happens.
It really does.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today as you go about your life. Considering that so much of the world's advancement during this era, like the preservation of classical knowledge, the leaps in medicine, the trade networks, was essentially a byproduct of brutal, relentless warfare, does history's greatest progress fundamentally require the friction of conflict? Or is there a way for humanity to achieve that kind of profound global connection without the tragedy? Think about that next time you look at a map. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.